The title of these talks, Reasons to Believe. And you wouldn't be sitting here unless you believed that in your brain there is the capacity to reason. And if you believe that you have the ability, I'm not saying you believe you're Einstein, but that you've got the ability to weigh up evidence, that you've got the ability to think, to reason, to work things out, to consider the strength of evidence, then I want you to think about why it is that you have that ability. Talking about Einstein, this is one of his famous quotes, that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. And what the physicists tell us is that the universe needn't have been comprehensible. From the point of view of science, it could have been a multitude of other ways. Why is it intelligible? Why is the universe working according to law? Why is it that rationality and reason are features of that universe? This is another popularizer of science, physicist. I'm going to show you quite a lot of quotes. I'm not quote mining. I'm not trying to pick quotes from the opposition. Not many anyway. But I want to give you enough quotes to you to realize it's not just us quirky people who organize these seminars who think this way, and there's plenty of resources there for you to look at the end to follow up some of these things. But Paul Davies is a popularizer of science, and he's a physicist, well-known, internationally renowned physicist. And what he says is, the people take it for granted that the physical world is both ordered and intelligible. The underlying order in nature, the laws of physics, are simply accepted as given, as brute facts. Nobody asks where they came from. At least they do not do so in polite company. Or even the most atheistic scientist accepts as an act of faith that the universe is not absurd, that there is a rational basis to physical existence manifested as law-like order in nature, and that is at least partly comprehensible to us. So science can proceed only if the scientist adopts an essentially theological worldview. Because he says that tongue-in-cheek, he realizes that the scientific community would find that, Paul Davies is not a Christian as far as I can tell. I think he may acknowledge there is a greater force, but he's not known as a religious man. He's known as a scientist and a popularizer of science. And what he's saying is that the scientific world takes it as read that we can reason logically. Otherwise, there'd be no point. There'd be no science. Science depends upon the agreed belief that we can reason things out. Where did that phenomena arise? What I'm going to show you later on, if you stick with me, is that the rationality upon which science depends itself depends upon there being a rational mind behind the universe. And without that rational mind, there's no reason to think that what we think is rational, or even could be rational. Just the chance product of atoms and the laws of physics and chemistry. So I want us to think about thinking. We're not asking you to believe in a creator as blind faith. What we're suggesting that there are reasons to hold that belief. And one of those reasons is indicated here by Professor Paul Davies, the order and intelligibility of a world that runs according to laws. And the link with the Creator is sometimes overlooked. You see, modern science began with Bible believers seeking to understand the mind of God. The BBC and popular media, and so certainly the liberal secular culture of our Western civilization wants to give the impression that science has removed the need for God, has displaced God. But I suspect in school and college, people still talk about Newton's laws and Faraday's laws and Boyle's law. And those great scientists which set the science on its modern course were ardent believers in a creative fact. Their endeavor, the endeavor of the scientist, was to understand how God had set order in the world. And when we use our powers of reason, we may change our minds. As evidence accumulates, we hope that we are rational people, that we're not reacting emotionally or based on prejudice, that we are thinking through the new evidence. I may hopefully show some things which are new to you, or at least new thoughts for you to take into consideration. I wanted to start off with a philosopher who did change his mind about the existence of God. He died not that long ago. His belief, I don't think you could say he was a Christian or any other particular follower of a creed. He was a deist. He'd come to the conclusion that there must be a God. I think that may be as far as he went. But for most of his academic career, as a philosopher in universities in Britain and Canada, he was the world's leading atheist philosopher. He was one of the humanists that helped frame the Humanist Charter, and he was well known in his field. And then later in life, and of course the unpleasant followers of evolution and there is no God school said, well, that's what happens when you get old. Which is a bit of a cheap shot, really, because I can see there's people in the audience here who are at least as old as me. And we still think, don't we, that we are capable of rational thought. Not always, I admit, not always. But when we're at our best, we're capable of rational thought. Well, this is what happened. So Anthony Flew changed his mind, and he wrote a book, There Is a God. And the starting reason he gives is this, that nature obeys laws. And he quotes, and these are his quotes in his book, and they're well-known quotes. Stephen Hawking, everybody knows who Stephen Hawking is, yes. The overwhelming impression is one of order. The more we discover about the universe, the more we find that it is governed by rational laws. That's my highlight. Albert Einstein, whoever has undergone the intense experience of successful advances in this domain is moved by profound reverence for the rationality made manifest in existence, the grandeur of reason incarnate in existence. And another world-famous physicist, Paul Dirac, God is a mathematician of a very high order, and he used advanced mathematics in constructing the universe. He's saying that tongue-in-cheek. What he's admitting to is that there is such extraordinary... Any mathematicians here? Any math students? There are not many clever people in the audience. There's one or two. Keep his head down. Okay. That the universe is capable of being described in mathematical terms and predictions being made. That's how you can land something on the moon or on a meteorite or something. This is an amazing thing. How come? So that has impressed people, the existence of rationality and reason and order and law. So that was the first thing. The second thing is this. This is some amazing slides you can plagiarize on the web. This is to illustrate space-time is expanding. So we're told, how would I know? Scientists tell us, don't they, that the universe is expanding. And they say, well, it is expanding, and therefore, if you went back in time, it must have had a beginning. So one of the great findings of modern science is that the universe had a beginning. What a incredible thought, isn't it? The universe had a beginning. There was an argument when I was still in school. They were still arguing about whether there was a steady state universe or whether there was a universe which had a beginning. Everybody agrees now that there was a beginning. And this is what our philosopher, former atheist philosopher says. If the universe had a beginning, it became entirely sensible, almost inevitable, to ask what produced the beginning. Modern cosmologists seem just as disturbed as atheists about the potential theological implications of their work. So, as a philosopher, he says, look, there's only three possibilities. This is what you've got to use your trillions of nerve connections to assess, all right? Either everything came from nothing, in other words, there was nothing before that beginning. There was a beginning, and before that there was nothing. Now we can't. I don't know how many billions of cells you need, but you can't really cope with that concept. Everything comes from nothing. But some people want us to believe that. It's absolutely preposterous. And we are the ones who are accused of having blind faith. To say that everybody, everything, everywhere came from nothing, and nobody did it, is the most extraordinary thing to ask anybody to believe. Well, maybe there's always been something. Maybe before the beginning there was something else. But who knows what that could have been. Or there's a power that caused that universe to come into existence. So as a philosopher says, those are your choices, right? What do you believe? So ask yourself, what do you believe? Which one of those three do you think is the best guess? Everything from nothing, or the universe didn't really have a beginning because there was always something there, or there is a creator, there is something beyond our universe, there is a power outside our universe, there's something more majestic than that which we can see, which has caused this to come in. And none of those things is philosophically inadmissible. They're not illogical. These are the logical conclusions of the universe having a beginning. Now, if you just take this middle one, something has always been, you come to Stephen Hawking, rated to be one of the cleverest men in the world, and he wrote a book in 2010 called The Grand Design. And in it, he made a statement which has been debated quite a lot since. He says, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing. Why we exist. It is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going. Now, the flaw in his argument, how can such a clever man have a flaw in his argument? You know, who would dare point out and say, Stephen Hawking, you're wrong? Right? But what he says, because there is a law such as gravity, what he's saying is before there was a universe, there was something called the law of gravity, and because the law of gravity existed, the universe had to come into existence. So there's no point invoking God to say that's the cause of the universe. The law of gravity is the cause instead of God. But the point that seems to have passed him by is who created the law of gravity? Where did gravity come from? So there wasn't nothing before the universe. There was gravity. But the other flaw is this, that a law can't cause anything to happen. Now, let me just, have you ever thought about this? I didn't work all this up myself. John Lennox, professor of mathematics at Oxford University, the doyen of the theistic answers to the new atheists, wrote some excellent books, which if you really are serious about following up, I put these books up there because he's just a very clear way. And he's a professor of maths in Oxford, and he's also trained in philosophy as well. And this is what he says, that physical laws on their own cannot create anything. They are merely a description of what normally happens under certain conditions. Gravity, if there was a law of gravity, you say, oh, well, no, gravity, the law, is a description of a phenomenon. Nobody really understands what these phenomena are. There are laws. What do we mean by that? There are regularities in the observations that we make, upon which we can make predictions. But what is a force? What is the force of gravity? Nobody understands. And it is Ludwig Wittgenstein, again, world famous philosopher of the 20th century, who says that the great delusion of modernity is that the laws of nature explain the universe for us. The laws of nature describe the universe. They describe the regularities. They explain nothing. So, nonsense is nonsense, says John Lennox, whoever says it. And that's a reminder that, sometimes, often, scientists make pronouncements which are metaphysical rather than scientific. And the media reports these as the scientists have said, or even worse, science has said. But what they are statements of belief of scientists. And that belief is called philosophical naturalism. Right? It's an assertion that the only things that exist are the things you can see and measure. The only things there are the material things of the universe. But that is based on what? Why would my belief that all there is what I can see and measure tell you that there's nothing else? There's no basis. It's an acceptance of a preference. We would rather believe that there is nothing else out there. The world of strict naturalism, in which clever mathematical laws all by themselves bring the universe and life into existence, is pure fiction. You have to ask where all these things came from. Now, you may say, I think they've always been, except physics is telling us, no, there was a beginning. Or you say, well, it just came from nowhere. Or you say, there is a power outside the universe that we'll call God, who caused it to exist. But when you make such an argument, and you may find this when you talk to people in college at work, you say, well, if you believe in a creator, who created the creator? Gotcha. Ooh, that's a good one. It's rather silly, really. Stephen Hawking again. It is reasonable to ask who or what created the universe. But if the answer is God, then the question has merely been deflected to that of who created God. That's one version of it. Here's another version of it. Richard Dawkins. A designer God cannot be used to explain organized complexity, because any God capable of designing anything would have to be complex enough to demand the same kind of explanation. And that argument has been repeated many times, even though philosophers of all persuasions have shown that it's a false assertion. Because what is assumed here is this very idea that God is a natural being within the universe we're talking about. It's the sort of God the Bible rejects. Nobody's postulating a God who needs a cause. We're postulating a God who has been forever. That's the best explanation. So that argument, the argument there, is not really an argument at all, because it's assuming that our concept of God is one that can be reduced to something which is part of the created order, which itself needs an explanation. What we're saying is that outside of this created order is an uncreated being who has caused these things to come into existence. At least as a hypothesis, you might want to hold that as different from the sort of God assumed by these critics. This is put very well by Richard Swinburne, who is a professor of philosophy, again in Oxford University, published a book on Is There a God? These are serious academics. I put them up because this is Oxford, not Cardiff. Although John Lennox had been a lecturer in Cardiff University, he got promoted to greater things. Right? And so this is what Richard Swinburne says. Look, I'm not postulating a God of the gaps. What is the God of the gaps? God, sometimes we say, that flower is so beautiful, science can't explain it. God must have done it. That's a God of the gaps. Then science comes along and says, that pretty colour, that's because of the refraction of light, or therefore we've explained it. You don't need God to explain it. I don't know anybody actually thinks about the God of the gaps in that way, but that's what he's saying. We're not talking about a God merely to explain things that science has not yet explained. I am postulating a God to explain why science explains. Why there is such a thing as reason, rationality, law and order in the universe. That we're postulating that behind that lies a rational mind. Now, why is it that, if it's true that the great majority of scientists don't find this acceptable today, why is that? I'm going to put this quote up from Richard Lewington, again, famous biologist and ardent evolutionist. Sometimes we're accused of taking a quote out of context, so I put a lot of contextual words there. It's an article in which Richard Lewington is arguing against witchcraft and things like that. But in it, he makes a statement. He says, there are some things in science which are counterintuitive. Right? They don't seem to make common sense, like particle physics, where a particle can be in two states at the same time, or apparently two particles can be going away from each other at the speed of light and yet in immediate contact with each other. So that's just Barney. That can't happen. But what he says is we accept some of these things. But look what he says, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods of institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes. You see what he's saying? In other words, when people say science has shown, science has assumed a naturalistic explanation as the only explanation which is valid. They've written God out of the equation. They've defined science as something that doesn't need God. Now, what we're not saying is you need God in your equation, but the very fact that you can have an equation is an expression that there is an intelligent mind behind the universe. I come across this National Academy of Sciences, the United States Academy, most prestigious scientific organization in the world, and it's got a real bee in its bonnet against creationism. And part of that is political. The United States creationists want to bring God into the school, and the Constitution of the United States doesn't allow religion in schools, and therefore the big argument in the courts is more about politics than it is about religion and science. But when creation science is talked about, this is what the US National Academy of Sciences says about science. It says, it fails to display the most basic characteristic of science, reliance upon naturalistic explanations. So that's the definition of science. If you say, yes, but I believe in a creator, you're not a scientist. That's outside of it. So where did science come from? Isn't a scientific question, is it? Because a scientist can't answer it. Because if you ask, what came before the material universe? What came before nature? You've got no answer at all. You think, well, don't scientists think about this? Well, John Lennox points out, yes, there are lots of scientists, even in Oxford, who do accept the existence of God. I don't think that all scientists or only poor scientists accept the existence of God. That's just not true. They don't have much of a voice. They don't get on to the media very often. But he says there are So what I'm asking you to do is to think about where reason comes from, where the reasoned possibility comes from. And at least you might say to yourself, well, is it just possible there is a mind behind all of our minds? There's a mind that is reflected in the order and intelligibility of the world in which we live. Because without that, there's no science, you can't do science. And if you don't agree with me, like the explanation, at least think to yourself, well, what is the explanation? You might say, well, I don't know. Well, if you don't know, why are you so certain it's not God? Another line of thought. This is Isaac Newton. Of course, he was a great scientist and a great Bible reader. And he thought that atheism is senseless because the sun and the earth are just the right distance away from each other. Right? And that's the beginning of sort of the Goldilocks idea, which, if he only knew what modern science would do, he would, I'm sure, be amazed. That what's been found out is that the universe is fine-tuned for life to a degree which is amazing, right? And what they mean is not that just the sun and the earth are the right distance apart to sustain life, right? But that the very fundamental particles and forces of nature that hold atoms together, that make matter possible, that allow carbon to be formed, are exquisitely fine-tuned. I could show you a lot more about that, but exquisitely fine-tuned. And then the scientists who say that also tell us that it didn't have to be so. If everything started with a big explosion, it could have fallen out in many different ways. This is just the most amazingly improbable thing, that the universe we live in has come about like that. Stephen Hawking, our universe and its laws appear to have a design that is both tailor-made to support us, and if we are to exist, leaves little room for alteration. You think, well, isn't it more likely to agree there's a God? And he says, but that's not the answer of modern science. Now, the answer of modern science is mind-blowing. What they say is that this universe is highly, highly improbable. Right? Like, way, way out of winning the lottery. This is beyond comprehension, how improbable. Oh, therefore, there must be trillions and billions and zillions of other universes. And if you have enough universes, then even the most improbable sort of universe will exist somewhere. Pardon? To get out of the fact that there may be a God creating the improbable universe, invent an infinite number of other universes, all running in parallel. This is what John Polkinghorne says, physicist. Let us recognize that these speculations, for what they are not physics, but they're metaphysics. See, how could you ever know there was a universe outside our universe? Because not a galaxy, not talking about a galaxy, talking about a universe outside our universe. You could never know that, could you? But would you rather invent an infinite number of them to get out of the possibility that there's a God? But it doesn't get out of that possibility. Because who created the multiverse? Who created the infinite number of universes? You've multiplied your problem by an infinite number of times. So, science takes us through mental hoops which don't bear consideration. The next point that Anthony Flew draws attention to is the origin of life. The origin of life is beyond the explanation of scientists. And I came across recently this Professor James Tour, and he works in Rice University in America. We're interested in him partly because our Ben is doing something similar, looking at chemistry of molecules in biological systems and how they operate and how they form. And James Tour is one of the top 10 chemists in the world. He has won enormous number of plaudits because of his ability to make these micro machines. And he's recently, and this is a brave thing for any scientist to do, he's written an open letter to his colleagues. So he's talked to the structural chemists throughout the world in a public journal and said, own up, we haven't got a clue how life began. Well, that's what he said. You can see him on YouTube. He's a good speaker, well worth looking. Basically, he says the probability of life, living organisms, which are made up of chemicals which are self-replicating, right? He says, look, I make chemicals. And you can't make these chemicals, because they're very particular chemicals, by putting everything in a bottle and heating it up. You just can't do it. He says life should not exist. And then he says in this open letter, life should not exist anywhere in our universe. Life should not exist on the surface of the earth. Yet we are led to believe that 3.8 billion years ago, the requisite compounds could be found in some cave or undersea vent, and somehow or other they assembled themselves into the first cell. He says, that is total nonsense. He says, if you know how to make molecules, you know that just is not possible. He says, we synthetic chemists should state the obvious. The appearance of life on Earth is a mystery. We are nowhere near solving this problem. The proposals offered thus far to explain life's origin make no scientific sense. So science cannot say where the universe came from, right? Would rather invent all these other universes. But science can't explain how life came to be on Earth, even if you say it came from another planet, somewhere in the universe. Well, where did that life come from? He says you can't make chemicals that you need for life in the sort of environments that exist or might have existed. So it's not, it's not, that's creationist talking here. This is one of the top chemists in the world speaking. Let me just show you how complicated life is. Now, I know some of you will have seen some of these things, but let's have a break and watch them for a while.
For the longest time, I believed that Darwinian evolution explains what we saw in biology. Not because I saw how it could actually explain it, but because I was told that it did explain it. In schools, I was taught Darwinian biology. In the 19th century, when Darwin was alive, scientists thought that the basis of life, the cell, was some simple glob of protoplasm, like a little piece of jello or something that was not hard to explain at all.
This perception didn't really change too much until the early 1950s, but in the last half century, our knowledge of the cell has just exploded.
Today, powerful technologies reveal elaborate microscopic worlds.
At the very basis of life, where molecules and cells run the show, we've discovered machines, literally molecular machines. There are little molecular trucks that carry supplies from one end of the cell to the other. There are machines which capture the energy from sunlight and turn it into usable energy.
There are as many molecular machines in the human body as there are functions that the body has to do. So if you think about hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting, feeling, blood clotting, respiratory action, the immune response, all of those require a host of machines.
When we look at these machines, we ask ourselves, where do they come from? And the standard answer, Darwinian evolution, is very inadequate in my view.
Many of Behe's doubts were tied to a remarkable biological motor.
I remember the first time I looked in a biochemistry textbook and I saw a drawing of something called a bacterial flagellum with all of its parts and all of its glory. It had a propeller and the hook region and the drive shaft and the motor and so on. I looked at that and I said, that's an outboard motor. That's designed. That's no chance assemblage of parts.
Behe's reaction was not surprising, for the molecular motors that drive bacteria through liquid each depend upon a system of intricately arranged mechanical parts. These parts come into focus when portions of a cell are magnified 50,000 times. Biochemists have used electron micrographs like this one to identify the parts and three-dimensional structure of the flagellar motor. In the process, they have revealed a marvel of engineering on a miniaturized scale.
Howard Berg at Harvard has labeled it the most efficient machine in the universe. These machines, some of them are running at 100,000 RPMs and are hardwired into a signal transduction or sensory mechanism so that it's getting feedback from the environment.
And even though they're spinning that fast, they can stop on a dime. It only takes a...
I'm sure you've seen that motor, so I won't leave it up for too long, and there's videos you can get of it. But never mind when Darwin was writing. When I was a medical student in Cambridge in the 1960s, we looked down electron microscopes to look at the cells, and they were still blobs of jelly. And inside were shadowy things, and they gave them names, but you couldn't see what was going on. Now, inside that cell is the most remarkable living form, the bacteria, has the perfect machine as its motor. It's got an electric motor fixed into it. Now, nobody imagined that. Darwin never thought that when you found out the secret of life, you would find it simple. Like the cell was like a bag of salty water, and things move by osmosis. Now we know, and I'll show you that roads are laid down for the transport of material. This next little clip is from a guy who's used modern technology in order to demonstrate. Drew Berry, his name is, and he's given a TED talk here.
I was very much inspired by this image many years ago, and I wondered whether we could use computer graphics to represent the molecular world. What would it look like? And that's how I really began. So let's begin. This is DNA in its classic double helix form, and it's from X-ray crystallography, so it's an accurate model of DNA. If we unwind the double helix and unzip the two strands, you see these things that look like teeth. Those are the letters of genetic code, the 25,000 genes you've got written in your DNA. This is what they typically talk about, the genetic code. This is what they're talking about. But I want to talk about a different aspect of DNA science, and that is the physical nature of DNA. And it's these two strands that run in opposite directions for reasons I can't go into right now, but they physically run in opposite directions, which creates a number of complications for your living cells, as you're about to see, most particularly when DNA is being copied. And so what I'm about to show you is an accurate representation of the actual DNA replication machine that's occurring right now inside your body, at least 2002 biology. So DNA is entering the production line from the left-hand side, and it hits this collection, this miniature biochemical machines that are pulling apart the DNA strand and making an exact copy. So DNA comes in, it hits this blue donut-shaped structure, and it's ripped apart into its two strands. One strand can be copied directly, and it can be seen spooling off down to the bottom there. But things aren't so simple for the other strand because it must be copied backwards. So it's thrown out repeatedly in these loops and copied one section at a time, creating two new DNA molecules. Now, you have billions of this machine right now whirring the right way inside you, copying your DNA with exquisite fidelity. It's an accurate representation.
You have billions of copies of those machines copying your DNA with exquisite fidelity. It's an amazing thing. The information for life in every cell is copied and copied and copied without mistake. There's even correction mechanisms. There are even machines that check the accuracy and pull out the errors and repair them with the right codes. That's amazing. That came about by chance. I mean, I'm not talking about a few Lego bricks sticking together if you shake a bag. We're talking about machines being created out of bits which don't even exist in the right place at the right time. And all of that being controlled by something. Now, this is just, I like this one, so I'm going to show it. This is one of the machines, this middle one called kinesin. Let me just give you a few minutes of kinesin.
Cells are full of specialized components that perform functions vital to their existence. But how do these components get to the right locations inside the cell to perform their functions? For larger components, a transportation system is needed. Meet the kinesin. Masterpieces of microengineering, kinesins are miniature motorized machines that carry cargo from one part of the cell to another, walking along self-assembling highways called microtubules. Known as the workhorses of the cell, kinesins have 2 feet, or globular heads, that literally walk 1 foot over another along the microtubule, pulling their cargo to its destination. Each foot possesses 2 special locations, called binding sites, that interact with other molecules. One site attaches to the microtubule, and the other binds with ATP, the energy molecule of the cell. When one foot binds with ATP and uses its energy, the foot flips over, resulting in the walking motion. Each foot has a short neck, which is connected to a strand of a long coiled stalk. At the end of the stalk is a fan-shaped tail, which holds tightly to the cargo being transported. Kinesin.
It's just mind-boggling. That's a simplified version of a little bit of a cell. A transport system with trucks and roads, but the trucks are laid down in front of the roads and picked up behind the truck as it goes along. Who's controlling that? Imagine, you've got to make the machine that does the carrying, but you also have to make the machine that makes the machine that does the carrying. And all of that is encoded in like a software program in the cell. And it has to be coordinated. It has to be managed. Something in the cell has to say this is needed at this time in that place. You think, oh yeah, that comes about by chance. Well, your rational mind is not telling you it came about by chance. Your rational mind is telling you that's designed. What's the chances of getting anything like that? Like just shift the improbability, right? If you took a bag of Scrabble letters, shook them around, you put your hand in, took out a letter, right? It could be one of any number of letters. Supposing the first one is the letter D for design. You put it back in, you shake the Scrabble letters, you take out the next one. It's the letter E. Oh, that's interesting. You put it back in, you shake it up, the next one you pull out is an S. What's your chances of pulling out the word design in a straightforward attempt like that? Well, one mathematician has worked it out. It's 309 million goes of that experiment before you get a chance of getting that one word design. Now, the letters of the genetic code are millions and millions and millions of letters long. It's all bundled up like a ball of wool that the cat's got hold of, and yet the cell has to open that ball up, reveal the bit of information required at that given time, have machinery that can translate it, take it to a factory to make the component, transport the component to the other part, send that other part somewhere else in the body. All that happens by chance. It defies the rational part of our mind. And, that's at the micro level. What about the grand level? Imagine the chances of a spider weaving a web for the first time. What's the early stages of weaving a web? I tell you what it is, the spider sticks to the web and can't get off. Right? Because not only do you have to have a web, you have to have a web the spider doesn't stick to. You can't, if you don't have both of those things together, you don't have a spider's web that's of any function. It's called irreducible complexity. The example I like, because I see them in the wild, are leafcutter ants. These leafcutter ants, they go out, there's no leader, they got no boss, they got no king, they all go off, they cut down the leaves of a tree, they bring them back to the nest to eat. No, they don't. They bring them back to munch them up, to provide compost. On the compost, they grow mushrooms. They eat the mushrooms. That mushroom only grows on the compost of those ants. Because of that, when the queen ant goes off to start a new colony, she takes a mouthful of the mushroom with her to seed the compost in the next nest. Tell me how that arises by chance, mutation, and natural selection. And the answer is, it's luck. You end up saying that we're incredibly lucky to live in a world which is just right for life, and we're incredibly lucky to have evolved like this. Well, we had to be lucky because here we are, and there's no other explanation. That's what people will do to get out of accepting the possibility that there is a creator. So Darwin had his own test of evolution. In The Origin of Species, he said if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would break down. His whole thesis was based upon the fact that all this complexity, because he didn't know what it was, could come about by small step changes. When it's a cybernetic system, it requires feedback loops. You can't have small changes with disastrous consequences. And when he wrote to Asa Gray in 1860, this is what he says. It's curious, I remember well the time when the thought of the eye made me cold all over. Why did it make him cold all over? Because he couldn't imagine how you could get an eye by small successive changes. He says, I've got over that now. Now, small trifling particulars make me feel very uncomfortable. How did a peacock's feather evolve? There's a book there, Don might mention it at the end here. Professor Burgess from, you've got it here, is it? Okay, great, thanks. Don. Stuart Burgess is a professor of design engineering at Bristol University, and he's written a book on the design and origin of man, and he's got other books as well. And it is, he writes up the book on the peacock's feather, and it's an amazing complexity. Right? You can't imagine how chance could. So you say, well, yes, but surely all biologists must know that, and they still believe it. So, you know, Palmer, you're out on your own. You're a nut. You know, the great establishment of science accepts Darwinism. Well, they're having real problems. A year ago, a much publicized meeting was going to be held in the Royal Society, and it was going to look at new trends in evolution. Now, the creationists sneaked in, and it was, the Royal Society knew that the creationists would be around. They were very careful what they didn't say about admitting to the deficiencies of evolution. So I have to rely upon, I have listened to the first talk by this guy. I'm not sure I understood it very well at all, but this is an account on what he said, right? They talked about the yet unsolved problems of evolution. Right? Now, what are those unsolved problems? Phenotypic complexity. What do they mean? The origin of eyes, etc. Unsolved. Unsolved problem. Phenotypic novelty. The emergence of different kinds of animals. Unsolved problem. Non-gradual forms of transition. Why there are gaps in the fossil record. 12 months ago, the cleverest evolutionists in the world were gathered together in the Royal Society in London to discuss the as yet unsolved problems, and lo and behold, those are the very, very problems that we know that science cannot explain. So, what am I asking? I'm asking you to think about your rational mind weighing up evidence. You know what that noise is? Try and concentrate. Right. Try and use your rational mind. I've blocked out all that irrational speculation as to what that noise is. If you smell fire, we'll all get out of it. On the one hand, you have design, mind, deliberate, living, purposeful, intentional reason and order. And on the other side, no God, random, chance, evolution. I'm going to finish by quoting this philosopher. Thomas Nagel is an atheist. That's why it's so powerful. He's an atheist and professor in New York. World famous, all these guys are world famous, right? World famous philosopher, atheist. They tend to write their books as they get to the end of their career, because if they'd written them at the beginning of their career, they wouldn't have had a career. It's a real serious issue, actually. A real serious issue. People dare not speak out about design without fearing that their jobs will go and their prospects are zero. This is what he says, right? Science is driven by the assumption that the world is intelligible. Without the assumption of an intelligible underlying order, there'd be no science. It's that very intelligibility that needs an explanation. John Lennox says this: can rationality really arise through unguided natural processes? And this is what we're talking about. This is Richard Dawkins. The universe is nothing but a collection of atoms in motions. Human beings are simple machines. If that's the case, what's our explanation for all the things that we hold so precious? If all we are is chemistry and physics, there can be no higher order of thinking. Darwin himself admitted to the problem. He says, with me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. You know, what he's saying is, if all we are is the product of an evolutionary process, that some primitive ape had a chance mutation, made it a little bit cleverer, and then that next generation was a little bit cleverer, eventually you get to humans, all you can say is those little bits of cleverness had value in survival. You can't say they have value for seeking truth. You can't say they have value in being rational. You can't say they have value for anything that goes above natural phenomena. All you can say is they had some survival value. How could you trust a brain produced like that? How could you say that that brain is telling me what is true? Stopped him sleeping at night. Why should I think that my own thoughts are meaningful? And so Thomas Nagel goes on to say, seems to me it is usually the current orthodoxy about the cosmic order is the product of assumptions that people make. And he says, I would like to defend the untutored reaction of incredulity to the reductionist neo-Darwinian account of the origin and evolution of life. It is prima facie highly implausible that life as we know it could have happened. He wants to say, look, the man in the street, the woman in the street, looks at this and says, you're telling me all that came about by chance? Don't be silly. He says, I'd like to defend that. He says, you tell me where life came from. You tell me where different animal forms came from. You're telling me they came about by small variations and chance selection. And then he goes on to say, I realize that such doubts will strike many people as outrageous, but that is because almost everyone in our secular culture has been browbeaten into regarding the reductive research program as sacrosanct, on the ground that anything else would not be such. That's a brave philosopher. Of course, he's been attacked. You can read the attacks on him, because there's a vested interest in that system to defend itself. They've been freed from the constraints of there being a God, and they don't want to go back to it, even though the evidence is accumulating of such complexity and order as to demand an intelligent mind behind the universe. And he says that evolutionary naturalism provides an account of our capacities that undermines their reliability. In other words, if you insist to me that your intelligent mind is the product of evolution, it diminishes the intelligence of your mind. Because you can't insist that you can come to any rational conclusion because you're just an evolved species. The basis of rationality doesn't lie within that struggle for existence. It just means selective advantage to survive. If you as a scientist are adamant that you have rationality as your reason for being a scientist, then you've got to think of a better explanation. C.S. Lewis said a long time ago now, if all that exists in nature, the great mindless interlocking event, if our own deepest convictions are merely the byproduct of an irrational process, then there's not the slightest ground for supposing, in my words, that what we're thinking has any truth value at all. So I want you to come next week, if you will, because this majestic opening of the Bible actually presses all the buttons. The rationality behind the universe, the designer behind the design, the one who gives meaning to life, meaning to your life, meaning to my life. And those of us who are keen readers of the Bible will know that that life, God's life, has a purpose which is coming to a climax. That the world is progressing in a way that the Bible has described thousands of years ago in a most remarkable way. So when you go home, you lay that most sophisticated computer ever on the pillow. You have some thoughts to think about. And when you wake up the next day, God willing, I do hope that you will still be wondering what all this means. And at least this, give this one chance. Maybe the Creator has spoken to us. Just maybe that's what the Bible